Hey everybody, it's Jason from the Texas Gun Vault, and once again I'm coming to you with another range report. And in today's range report, we're going to be taking a look at something very interesting and very cool. The firearm that we will be taking to the range, shooting and reviewing is the Vector Arms V53. This is a US-made clone of an HK53. So it has the shorter barrel. In fact, this one is 8.3 inches. It uses the roller delayed locking system like an MP5, which borrowed that system from the famous G3 rifle, and it is chambered in 5.56. So if you're saying to yourself, that looks like an MP5, you're kind of right. It uses a very similar receiver, locking mechanism, and because it's part of the 50 series, it has a short barrel, so it kind of has the same look and profile. Now, you should know something about the HK naming nomenclature, that the first digit of the Legacy Guns number simply dealt with the series. So a 9 series would have been a long-barreled version, the 5 series was a shorter-barreled version, and the number told you the caliber. If it was a 1, it was chambered in 308. If it was 2, 7.62 by 39, 3, 5.56, and 4 was 9mm. And so that's what this is. It's a clone of an HK53. Now, this was made, as I mentioned, by Vector Arms, and this was a company that is now defunct, but really had its heyday in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And this was a time before we had all these current imports of HK clones and even some guns from HK. And this was in a time after the George H.W. Bush administration, where he banned the importation of guns like this through executive order. And so the firearms companies that popped up during this time had spotty reputations. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. And Vector Arms kind of has one that has mixed sentiments. Some people think they're really good, some people think they're really bad. I guess it just depends on your personal experiences with them. Now, as I mentioned, Vector Arms is out of business, and it was owned by a gentleman with the last name of Merrill, and he is actually serving time in a federal penitentiary for importing and using Chinese-made ammo and selling it to the United States military. I'm not really up on his case, but I know the feds went after him, and then this business had to go away because he lost his manufacturing license. Now, the other reason this company is known for its spotty reliability with their guns is many of the parts that they procured for these builds were supplied by a man named Todd Bailey. And if you are familiar with all of these HK clones, it's a name that will inevitably come up. He was not known for making and producing the best HK guns, but pretty much he was the only guy doing it. So if you could not afford a real HK, you had to get a US-made one. He was the guy you had to go to. And once again, some of his stuff was known to be okay and pretty good, and some of it was known to be pretty bad. And his reputation online, based off of the many HK forums, is honestly pretty bad, especially because of his customer service. But that's essentially the history of this gun and this company, and what I know about this gun. And we're going to talk about all the things that I like and don't like, and of course we're going to get this to the range and actually see how it performs. But before we do that, as always, I want to thank the people that make these videos possible. First and foremost is the owner of this very cool firearm. He's a local fan and subscriber. His name is Jack. In fact, he's the second person named Jack that has lent guns to the channel, so I call him Jack number 2. Yes, I know that is a silly name, but I don't want to confuse him with Jack number 1, the OG Jack. I always want to thank my Patreons, because through their monthly donations and support, they help keep the lights on around here, and I could not produce all this content without their support. And if you want to join my Patreon for as little as $1 a month, it really helps keep all this going, and you get to see all of these videos early. There's a link in the description below. And as always, I want to thank my primary sponsor, who provides all of the ammunition for these range reports and makes them financially feasible for me, my good friend Mark from Brownworks. And here we are once again reviewing a classic firearm. And if you love classic firearms, you probably have quite a few in your collection. You probably have a Colt 1911, a Browning High Power, a CZ75, or a Beretta 92, just to name a few. And you might be in the market for a set of wood panel grips to make your guns in your collection unique and one of a kind. Well, the grip company you need to check out is Brownworks. Brownworks is a custom grip company making a wide variety of grips for a wide variety of firearms out of a wide variety of exotic woods and materials. Mark is an artist and a craftsman. He can apply custom logos, custom engravings, custom textures, finish these grips on a wide variety of colors. He can create his own laminate woods and even apply exotic materials like snakeskin and alligator skin to these grips to make them unique and one of a kind. Every grip he makes is made to order. Anything you can imagine, he can create. So I'm going to put a link to his website in the comment section below, as well as a coupon code for 10% off your first order. And when you go over there and see everything he has to offer and you place your order for your first set of custom grips, please tell Mark the Texas Gun Vault sent you. Alright, so let's talk about the really cool and interesting firearm we have on the workbench today, give you some close-ups and talk about how it is set up. This is the Vector Arms V53, a US-made clone of the HK53. It uses a stamped sheet metal receiver like the originals and also uses the roller locking delay blowback system. It is chambered in 5.56 and it has an 8.3-inch barrel with a 1-in-9 twist rate. The owner of this really cool firearm, Jack, has put on a few modern accessories such as an M-LOK handguard. We have some Magpul furniture like a Magpul vertical foregrip, the Magpul lower, and the Magpul telescoping stock. And Magpul does a really nice job with their HK gun accessories. I'm very, very impressed with them. So now let's talk about a few things about this gun that I like and don't like. And I always want to start with the positive first. And the first thing I love about this gun, obviously, is that it is a clone of an HK legacy firearm. And the reason I like that is when I was first getting into firearms, I wanted a gun like this, but I couldn't afford one, and they were really hard to find, especially the originals. But these clones made them much more accessible to a wider audience, and so they're more affordable. Plus, if you can get a real HK93 or 53, well, maybe you don't want to shoot it so much because it is collectible, parts are hard to come by, and you want something that you can take to the range, simulate that experience, and enjoy. And that's what this gun offered. So you could go to the range and not worry as much, plus you wouldn't break the bank. And I feel like these clone companies really did a good job and tried to fill a hole in the market that definitely wanted something like this. I'm also, once again, very impressed with the Magpul furniture that Jack has put on this. It really seems to be high quality. The polymer seems really nice and everything fits on the gun really well. When it comes to many of these clones, often the parts will not fit on them like they should because the receivers might be a little bit out of spec. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. I do like the fact this version does have the paddle magazine release. It also has a button here on the side, and many of the semi-automatic SBRs or pistols had an issue because in order for them to be built, the ATF required them not to have a third pinhole up here in the front of the lower, which would normally allow you to put on a full auto receiver. And that just has to do with US law. So they have to have what's called a semi-automatic shelf. And that pin was also something that went through the receiver and held on to these paddle mag releases. So if you wanted one of these, they had to be specially installed by a gunsmith. And this one has one, and I think they did a really good job because it makes getting these magazines in and out of the gun so much easier. So now let's talk about a few things about this gun that I don't like. And I mentioned earlier about the receivers being a little bit out of spec. Now this one I think actually is, because when I first got this firearm from Jack to review, he said, hey, you probably want to run this with a red dot. So he had installed a claw mount rail to go on the top. And these receivers, or HK originally designed them, to be able to do this. And they have these little ledges right here and right here. And so as long as these receivers are in spec, these claw mounts can go on there, you tighten them down, and they're very secure. But when I took this to the range for the very first time, this mount moved to the right. It wasn't staying on the receiver very well. And then I took a closer look and I noticed it was hanging on by its bare knuckles. And I realized the receiver is a little bit out of spec. And I talked about this on my second channel, the Texas Gun Vault 2, and other people that have owned this model or currently own this model say they have the same issue as well. And that's just because some of these parts were coming from suppliers that were not known to really take quality into consideration. They just got it close and thought it was good enough. The other thing about this gun I don't like is its barrel length. Now I know when it comes to HK guns, everyone wants the short barrels, but when it comes to one chambered in 5.56, I've always wanted to shoot and review the HK93, not the 53, because an 8.3 inch barrel is going to be loud and obnoxious, and I'm just not really into the flamethrowers and the ones that have a really loud report. I guess if you shoot a couple rounds, it's kind of cool, but over the entire range experience, it can get a little bit annoying. So I'm hoping this one is not gonna be that bad, but most likely it is. I just prefer intermediate and rifle calibers to be in longer barrel lengths. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we go to the range is the trigger pull. I like to do this in all of my range reports, and I want to get out the Lyman trigger pull weight gauge and measure it. So let me go ahead and adjust the camera. Let's take a closer look at this trigger before going to the range, and then we're going to find out how this thing actually shoots. So now let's take a closer look at the trigger in this V53. Now this should be very similar to the other HK guns I have reviewed because pretty much they use the same trigger packs in them, or they're designed very similar. Let's of course drop the magazine, ensure there is no ammunition in it, set that aside, and then of course we have to lock open the action, visually inspect that chamber, make sure it is empty and safe, and it looks like we are good. So now let's take a look at this trigger pull. Now, of course, this is a semi-automatic single action trigger, so we have a little bit of take up here. We come back to a definitive wall. It breaks, and you see how far that trigger travels when it breaks. Now let's take a look at this reset. It is quite long, but you are back at that wall. Overall, that's not too bad for a 5.56 CQB style gun. It does feel like it might be a little bit heavy though, so let's actually measure it. Let's get out the trigger gauge. Let's clear the averages, and let's see how heavy this trigger actually is. For our first pull, we have 7 pounds, 12.2 ounces. And you really got to make sure that bolt slams home so the gun will reset itself. And that's just indicative of these rifle calibers in these HK guns. I have an HK91 that is exactly the same way. For our second pull, 7 pounds, 7.9 ounces. £7 pounds, 12.5 ounces. £7 pounds, 11.7 ounces. And finally we have 7 pounds, 9.6 ounces, which gives us an average of 7 pounds, 10.8 ounces. So that really is a very heavy trigger pull. So hopefully that will not affect the shooting experience in a negative way. But now talking about the shooting experience, let's get this gun to the range. As always, when it comes to any gun I can shoulder, we're going to start off at 10 yards. And I just want to get my initial thoughts and experiences documented with this gun. Is it going to be loud and obnoxious? Is it going to be accurate? What's the recoil like? Well, let's go to the range and find out. And being that this is my first time ever shooting a 5.56 HK Legacy gun, that actually went exactly as I was expecting. Number one, this gun is loud and obnoxious. In fact, going forward for the rest of this range report, I'm going to go ahead and run this suppressed. I think that's just going to make a much more pleasurable shooting experience. But now let's talk about a couple things about the gun that I did discover. Number one, the charging handle is a little bit more difficult to use than that of an MP5. Because the 5.56 cartridge is much higher pressure, the locking mechanism has to be a little bit stronger. And so in order to get leverage to unlock this, you have a lever here on the charging handle, and it takes a lot more energy to pull that back. If you're used to shooting an MP5, you know how easy it is. That's going to be a little bit more difficult. The recoil is also more than an MP5, and honestly, I think it's a little bit more than that of an AR-15. It doesn't recoil as smooth. It doesn't have that 9mm MP5 Cadillac recoil. And you'll notice that when I'm shooting it, it does have a little bit of muzzle rise. And then finally, we need to talk about the point of impact. Now, I'm going to be using the diopter sights for this review because, as I mentioned earlier, I was not able to get that claw mount for the red dot to work. And I'm discovering when I have this diopter sight in the back set for 100 yards and less, or 100 meters and less, I'm really having to get my head down on this stock. So right now it's shooting a little bit high, so I may need to adjust for that. So now let's go back to the range, and we're going to do this entire test again, but now I'm going to shoot it suppressed and see if anything changes, and hopefully this is going to be a much more pleasant shooting experience. And that definitely makes a huge difference. This gun is so much more pleasant to shoot with a suppressor. Now, I know some people are going to ask, what suppressor did I just mount to this firearm? Well, it is a Huxworks Helix 556K, and even with the suppressor, you saw it was still shooting some flames. Yes, the barrel is 8.5 inches, and this suppressor is one that is flow through, or it has low resistance, and these aren't known to suppress the flash all that much. But even with the suppressor, it's a lot more flash than I was expecting. And I'm still going to have to work on figuring out where to hold these sights. I do think it is a little bit uncomfortable to have to get my head so far down on the stock to align up the rear diopter with that front post. Now, some people are going to say this is a gun designed for longer distance engagements, but in the short barrel configuration, this gun was designed for CQB and SWAT teams, so that was its intended purpose. If you wanted to go out to further distances, you would get the longer barreled version. So I'm just going to test this at a 25-yard range because of the original philosophy of use of this gun. But now I want to see what the best accuracy I can get with it is. So I'm going to go back to the range, put a few more rounds through it at 25 yards, and I'm going to shoot it from the bench. And hopefully we're going to get this gun to group pretty well. So let's go back to the range. And that is a pretty darn good group, especially with iron sights, and I can't really at that distance see where those rounds are impacting the target. The group still is a little bit high, and I definitely think if I would have been able to get that rail on this receiver, a red dot would have made this gun shoot exactly where I wanted it to. So maybe the gun is shooting a little bit on the high side, but also I have to get my head so far down on that stock. It's just the way this gun is set up. So now the next test I want to do is the quick magazine change test. Now when I have reviewed MP5s in the past, one of my big complaints is that these guns use an antiquated manual of arms. And so in order for you to properly drop the magazine, get a fresh one in there, and get the gun back in action, after the last round in the magazine is spent, the gun will go click. It does not have a last round bolt hold open. You are then supposed to lock the gun open, drop the magazine. It kind of uses that rock and lock system. You insert the new one, and then you can do the famous HK slap, close the action, and you're back in business. But that is quite a few more steps than a standard modern sporting rifle or AR-15. And so that's probably going to mean you're going to do it a little bit slower. So let's go back to the range, see how fast I can shoot this in a quick burst, change the magazine out, and get it back into action. And as expected, that was slower than I would want it to be. And that's probably one of the main reasons many militaries around the world did not adapt this platform of rifle and instead go with the AR-15 or the M16. Now, the next test I want to do is see how fast I can pull this semi-automatic trigger. I want to do a mag dump through this just because honestly it's kind of fun. So let's go back to the range, see how fast I can pull this relatively heavy trigger, and see if I can keep the rounds on target. And that is definitely not as fun as shooting an MP5. And as you could probably see from the recoil, this gun is less controllable. It's just not an MP5. I'm sorry. I know some people are going to say, that gun shoots so smooth for me. And maybe it does, but 5.56 is definitely a different caliber than 9mm. And this locking system has to be a little bit more robust because it needs a little bit more delay in the action. As I showed you, when I pull this charging handle back, it wants to stay in battery because it is a blowback design essentially that has those rollers that delays the action. And if it didn't have that extra strength in the locking, the bolt would come back too fast. And because of that, you are going to get a little bit more recoil, and this gun is not as controllable. But now, speaking about controlling this gun, one of the great things about being a firearms YouTuber is that you have some friends that are SOTs, or special occupational taxpayers, and they follow my channel. And these people are allowed to own and build machine guns. And they knew I was going to the range, so they called me up and were like, Jason, we want to meet you at the range because we have something fun you might want to try out in that gun. And I knew exactly where they were going with this. And as you probably saw from the opening of this video, yes, they did have a full auto trigger pack for this thing. So let's go back to the range and let's just do another mag dump just in full auto and have some fun with it and actually see, is this gun controllable? I better be careful because I have a feeling this one's going to be a little bit more difficult to shoot than the MP5. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. That was a lot of fun. And as you could probably see from the gun recoiling in my shoulder, it's not as soft shooting as an MP5. I will also say the cyclic rate of this gun was higher than I would want it to be for 5.56. It just runs a little bit too fast. Now, some people might also point out that maybe I should have done some bursts instead of just a full auto mag dump. Well, I wanted to get the full experience with this gun, and I was kind of running out of ammunition. So I just wanted to do that one time and put a whole magazine through it as fast as I possibly could because I just wanted that experience. Now, something else I am noticing after putting all these rounds through it is this gun is getting a little bit warm, especially up here towards the front of the receiver and on this handguard. So I did get out the laser thermometer and measure it. So let me show you the results. And as you can see from those results, the front of this receiver and that handguard is getting a little bit hot. Not hot enough to necessarily burn you, but it is a little bit uncomfortable. And so having this vertical foregrip attached to this handguard does mitigate that heat a little bit and make the gun a more pleasurable firearm to shoot. So what are my final thoughts on the Vector Arms V53, an HK53 clone? This is definitely a cool gun. Of course, it's a copy of an HK. You gotta love that. It is collectible in its own right. Even though it's not an original AK, these can still fetch quite a pretty penny because people want to experience an HK legacy gun. And even though it's not original, as I said, it's a way for you to own something that shoots like the original without having to break the bank. I really would like to review one of these with the 16-inch barrel. I think I would enjoy that one a lot more because it would be more like a rifle, where this one is designed more like a pistol with a stock. It's more of a CQB weapon, and I think 5.56 is just a little bit too much for this platform. It is definitely a loud firearm, and it is obnoxious at the range, so if you're not going to run this with a suppressor, you're definitely going to get some looks. It's not as controllable as the MP5, and the manual of arms is a little bit more antiquated. Now overall, you saw I was struggling with the point of impact a little bit. It just shoots a little bit high. I could adjust that by bringing the stock so far up and getting my head over the stock to bring that front down. It just then would not be as comfortable to shoot. So on my star system, how would I rate the Vector Arms V53? Well, I'm only going to give this 3.5 stars out of 5. That's it. It shot well. I didn't have any reliability issues. It's just not an MP5, and that's what I'm going to compare it to. I think if I really want a gun this size in 5.56, I'm going to go with an AR-15 SBR. It's still cool. I'm glad I got to review it. I'm glad I got to shoot it, and shooting it full auto was definitely an awesome experience. But is this better than an AR-15 with such a short barrel? I don't think it is. I think the AR-15 is generally a better platform. But that's just my personal opinion. But you can tell me if I'm wrong in the comment section below. So have you ever shot a Vector Arms HK clone? Or have you ever shot or owned the original? And do your experiences with these guns mirror mine? Please tell me. So, as always, thanks for watching.